Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for Into the Archives, photography from the Colville Reservation. My name is Nicole Cromartie and I'm the Director of Education and Programs at the Clifford Still Museum. We are thrilled to be partnering tonight with Denver's Month of Photography and to be working with Mike Holloman, Washington State University Fine Arts professor and member of the Colville Confederated Tribes. He is joining us this evening from the galleries of the Jordan Snitzer Museum of Art and their exhibition currently on view, Follow the River, Portraits of the Columbia Plateau. We'll also be in conversation with the Clifford Still's own Milo Carpenter, our Associate Digital Archivist, who will be joining us tonight from the inside of our research lab at the Clifford Still Museum. So we are currently in the process of reinstalling our archives displays on the first floor of the museum. And tonight we'd like to focus our attention on one of the photographs that'll be on view in our new display, Portrait of a Woman Identified as Nellie Friedlander by Clifford Still, circa 1936, taken in Nespelem on the Colville Reservation. We're honored to have Professor Mike Holloman here tonight virtually to discuss this material as someone who has worked with CSM many times in the past and offers incredible insight about Still's time in Nespelem. I think it would be helpful to begin the conversation with an introduction to this community at Nespelem and how Still ended up there. Michael, would you like to turn your camera on and join us? Here we are. Welcome.
Thank you, Nicole. I just wanted to once again thank you with the opportunity to work again with the Clifford Still Museum and to this partnership with our museum here at Washington State University, the Jordan Snitzer Museum of Art. And to introduce myself properly, I'm an associate professor here at WSU. I'm also an enrolled member of the Colville Confederated Tribes. My mother's family were from the Arrow Lakes Band, and my grandfather was from the Coeur d'Alene tribe. So with that, it's nice to spend a little bit of time with you all this evening. And without further ado, if we can do the next slide. Thank you. Okay, we're working. Just to begin with, I want to contextualize the region I'll be talking about. I don't want to make assumptions that everyone knows exactly where in Eastern Washington Nespelem is, or really when I'm talking about the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Indian Reservation, who I'm talking about. Once upon a time in another life, it seemed like a big part of my life was collecting postcards. And I remember when I was in San Francisco, living there with my much coveted bachelor's degree in fine arts. I would go to travel around when I wasn't delivering bagels. That was my first job. And I would go to little places and collect postcards. And I found this, of all places, in San Francisco. And it was from the region really where I came from, in northeastern Washington, the far northeastern corner above the Kalispell Reservation, in an area called Medellin Falls. And I put this out there because in some ways it speaks to some of the things I want to contextualize this evening, is that all these streams, all these rivers are tributaries. At some point, they flow into the Columbia River. And it's that great kind of watershed of the Columbia River that is the homelands of most all the people that I'd be talking about today, and many that, of course, are still a part of the Colville Indian Reservation at Nespelem. So the map I have on the right kind of presents some of the names, not all the names, and this is actually a much kind of older map, so there are different spellings in that for a lot of these people. But nevertheless, I think it gives this kind of image of east of the Cascade Mountains and the rivers that do flow at some point from the Snake and others, the Okanagan and such, into the Great Columbia River. And that's what I wanted to present here. Next slide, please. Maybe as a chance to maybe talk a little bit more about San Francisco. Just I remember when I first lived there, I lived in the Marina District, and I would go down to the Palace of Fine Arts in the Marina, and it's really all that's left from the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition that was housed there. And reason I want to talk about that is this sculpture that I think so many people at some point have seen. It's recognized, The End of the Trail by James Earl Fraser, one of the most iconic images, well-known images, probably of a Native American. The original plaster sculpture I saw in Oklahoma City, and it's about 18 feet tall, and it's stunning. It won the gold prize for sculpture at the exhibition, and it's something that at that time really represented not just the building of the Panama Canal, this great achievement. It was also hearkening the end of the Pioneer West at that time, and it was the World's Fair was celebrating the incandescent light, you know, the automobile, all these things of modernity that were a part of the new century. And the image that James Earl Fraser created here was of course, a Native American on a horseback with his head down, a flaccid spear, and you know, moving off in many ways to the sunset. And that was the representation at that time of Native America. And for many people, they absolutely felt that was the inevitable destiny of Native Americans. Next slide, please. And really, in some ways, to kind of contradict that, to challenge that, to speak about the impact of that is this term imperialist nostalgia that I presented at one point at a presentation I was doing on Edward Curtis and Frank Matsura, a Japanese photographer from this region. And I don't know that I ever created such kind of, some people were really upset that I spoke about Edward Curtis in the context of imperialist nostalgia. The idea that in some ways we are complicit in the demise of something that at some point we are kind of reflecting upon with nostalgia, with some sense of yearning. And the truth is that we actually had a hand, or we at the least benefited from the destruction of that relationship, and maybe in this sense, that culture. And I present this because in some ways it's a stepping stone to the discussion, the impact of the domination of images. Talk to my students about the importance of visual literacy as a form of social, political, and cultural critique. And the idea that there's a long-term impact, of course, on how we present people, how people are thought to be represented, and how that affects them, not just historically, but to this day. Next slide, please. And as an example of that, I might use this image here. This is an image of some Chiricahua Apache students at their first day at Carlisle on the left, Indian School in Pennsylvania, and then the same students 4 months later. These images and quotation could be presented as an opportunity to discuss visual literacy, including the contextual quotation that goes along with it. And maybe what I would say is these images taken alone would tell different stories. The group of young children on the left, as they might have looked at one point in the late part of the 1800s, early part of the 20th century, or the image on the right as we would see them dressed in Western clothing. And we could have different conversations, but when we put them together with the quotation by Captain Pratt, who was the head of Carlisle Indian School, then we're talking about this absolute transformation. We're talking about a time frame that what was happening with the removal of Native children from their families as they're being placed into boarding schools, and the long-term impact of that. And it was this sense of trying to civilize Native American children the idea that for them to move into the future, that they had to be more non-native. And I think with that, we can start to look at the image in a different way, and we can start to think about, in some ways, what was forced assimilation? What was the long-term impact of that? In these discussions I would have with my students, and the images we have now take on a whole different quality. And it's with that that I think I might have something a little bit to share contextually this evening. Next slide, please. Because maybe if that was a kind of general background of a time frame that was taking place with the turn of the last century, I can kind of go from general to specific and offer some information here that I think as we provide some historical background to what was taking place on the Colville Indian Reservation. It was established in 1872 by executive order by Ulysses S. Grant, and it really brought together tribes from the whole region of Eastern Washington, parts of Idaho and Oregon, that ended up on the Colville Reservation, with only a handful of the tribes actually being in their homelands, their traditional homelands. So with that, it is a group of people that came together. Not all of them were people that at times maybe got along. And so this was maybe typical at times of just bringing Native people and putting them all together and expecting them to be able to function together. It was a challenge. It was challenging enough times as it was, and then these were added. And so the amount of resources that they had, the lands that they had, were something that they were able to kind of parcel out, and given certain kind of homesteads that they could work with. But the truth of the matter is that they were holding on to what they were able to, with the federal government really having the upper hand on where they lived and what they could do at that time. Next slide, please. And when I talk about that relationship with the federal government, it's a conversation I have quite a bit with students. Is I don't think we can talk about Native America, particularly in the last couple hundred years, without talking about federal policy in the relationship with Native America. And it's this ongoing kind of representation of the federal government trying to figure out what they were going to do with the Native people as they were developing and moving west. So the example here would be the Dawes Act, the Allotment Act, where the idea was taking tribal people and moving them from a tribal identity where whether it was treaty tribes or tribes that received their homelands on reservations from executive order, either way, they were thought of as kind of a collective body of people. By the time we get to the late 1800s, into the early part of the 20th century, the federal government recognized maybe this wasn't helping them assimilate fast enough. They weren't changing enough into a people that they expected them to be. They were maintaining their culture and identities as a body of people, and they didn't feel that this was something that was going to be beneficial to them, or the U.S. government for that matter. And they felt that owning property, of course, was the way to get them to change. So they started to break up their reservations into actual allotments of land where individual tribal members, male heads of household, would get a certain amount of property, be it land for grazing or land for cultivation. And it would be that ownership of private property and other things, as I present here, that would help them move into the 20th century and become civilized. Next slide, please. And the impact in our region was something like this. This is Eastern Washington, northeastern Washington. You can see Spokane right there on the Idaho border. And to your left, following the Columbia River as it moves north and then heads directly east at the Okanagan River, over to the Spokane Reservation, the Spokane River, and then straight due north again. That's where the Colville Indian Reservation is located, and we're looking kind of at its present size today. The areas that you see from around the Coeur d'Alene Reservation, the Spokane Reservation, all the way up to the Kalispel, the northern tribes, that whole kind of area around once upon a time was going to be tribal land, and these lands were ultimately removed over different acts of federal policy, and the allotment era absolutely restricted the size tremendously of the tribes as they were determined after they received their 160 acres that they didn't need all this land. And it was opened up for settlement. And primarily that exists today. The north half of the Colville Indian Reservation from the Okanagan River up the Columbia to the Canadian border still is part of the Colville Reservation, not in land holdings, but they were able to retain hunting and fishing and gathering rights there, which is pretty amazing. Next slide. And as we move past the era of allotment, we start to see changes. Of course, they realized it, as so many other federal policies, was an absolute disaster for the Native people. And they created the Indian Reorganization Act in the mid-1930s. And this, for the first time, offered the opportunity for the tribes to be sovereign, where they could start to have some self-determination and define for themselves through tribal governments what they felt were their needs, and to start to make choices their own about how they would manage the resources that they had. This was absolutely breaking away from an old model where you had the Indian agent and the federal government dictating to the natives what they could and couldn't have, and when they could get it. And this was transformative, surely not perfect by any means, but it was a change that was starting to take place in the mid-1930s. And this is an image of the Colville Tribal Council with hereditary chiefs at the Indian Agency in Nespelem. And this was from the mid-1930s. Next slide, please. And right around that same time, not too far from Nespelem, about 15 miles the way the crow flies, just downriver a bit on the Columbia, was Grand Coulee Dam. And of course, at that time, it had just started to be constructed. It was an absolute transformation of that region. And this image that we're looking at here is from Clydesdale. For many, for most, the first time they became aware of this image was at the Antiques Roadshow in 2006 from Palm Springs, when a woman had brought this image in to be appraised, and she had her husband and her husband had worked here at Washington State College, WSU, way back then, and was given this as a gift from the department chair at that time, who happened to be Worth Griffin, whose painting I'm sitting by at this particular point. Next slide, please. And what was happening around that time also, after Clifford Still and Worth Griffin traveled in 1936 up to Nespelem, Clifford Still had received a fellowship to do paintings at that time of tribal chiefs. That was an extension of a previous kind of grant that he received of painting regional pioneers. And they decided that Nespelem was the best place to do this. There were particular reasons why, I think, and one was mainly that a lot was happening at that point. It was also the reservation where most people thought of where Chief Joseph had been and the Joseph Band was. So there was some history there that was interesting and that they wanted, I think, to kind of connect with. And because there was a confederation of multiple tribes, I think they felt that gave them a variety of opportunities. And so with that, we kind of take a look here, and this is an image of some of the faculty and students that came to work at the Nespelem Art Colony between 1937 and 1941. And this is them painting a gymnasium there at the agency. And I'm pretty certain that this is the image of Frank Andrews, who was the nephew of Willie Andrews, Chief Willie Andrews. Next slide. And Jeff Creighton, J.J. Creighton did a great book on the Nespelem Art Colony, and he did some wonderful research. And I think this quote really kind of speaks to what they were hoping to achieve at that time, and to bring people out. And people did come out, not just students from Washington State College, or now Washington State University, but they had students come out from New York, from across the country, to be a part of this opportunity to paint at Nespelem. And in doing so, it functioned quite successfully for four summers. Next slide, please. But it also, it really did continue the critique that we surely have about this. It was utilizing these tropes, these ideas, these expectations of Native Americans that were going to vanish, well, at least the idea of what Native Americans were supposed to be at some point, of some authentic, maybe, Native identity. And it was promoting the potential, the probability of that, and the chance to be able to come paint them. And in a way that was absolutely maybe ethnographic at the least. So we have a terminology of representative types. This sense of presenting Native people in a very particular way was absolutely erroneous, because as much as Native people cared for those things, that the regalia, their culture, their ceremony, their dances, all these things that were very important to them and how they presented themselves, it was also happening at a very transformative time, and that they were navigating, and it presented a challenge for them, and it still does today. And this is the question, if I was talking with my students, that I would ask, is this just something of the past, or is this something that we can see these considerations and their long-term impact, and what our expectations of others might be? And so we think about this, and I really do hope that it is something that we'll continue to have conversations about. And I think it's absolutely worthy of that. Next slide. And so to talk about all these things, it's very difficult not to contextualize it with everything that was happening nearby. If you drive to Nespelem today, you have to, by many ways, go by Grand Coulee Dam, and there's no way to get around just how massive it is, what its impact is to the region. It surely was at the time for jobs during the Great Depression. It absolutely was for the importance to irrigation and to agriculture in the region, and ultimately electricity. Not just for homes, but inevitably the war broke out, and the need for hydroelectric power to build planes, to aluminum plant in Spokane, at Kaiser Aluminum, all these things were so necessary. And in that recognition, it's hard for us to think of anything else. It's even harder to sometimes think of the impact that this had on the indigenous people of this region. And that's something maybe I'd like to finish with. Next slide, please. And so with that in mind, the kind of sense here is that the Columbia River and the relationship to the tribes was beyond just subsistence. The relationship of the river was cultural identity. It was something that connected the people for thousands of years. It was something that they would follow long before the horse ever made it to this region. What they say is maybe around 1700. So you think of these thousands of years where people moved up and along the rivers. And this was how they interacted with each other. This is how they traded. This is how they were able to connect. And everything about that was something that informed who they were and what they were about, not just as a food source. And it was a remarkable food source, don't get me wrong, but it was something that absolutely informed everything about them. And after the building of Grand Coulee Dam, this great fish hatchery, one of many, but there were two very large fish hatcheries, falls, where they would fish on the Columbia River at the Dalles, at Celilo Falls, and at Kettle Falls here on the upper Columbia, not upriver from Nespelem. And these now are underwater as they built Grand Coulee Dam that did not have a fish ladder. So the salmon that came upstream to spawn stopped right there after they built the dam. And it completely stopped that food source, but it's stopped so many other things. And I will finish with this, as I remember when I worked at the Museum of Northwest Arts and Culture in Spokane, we would bring elders. And one of the tribal elders talked about the long-term impact of the dam and the loss of everything along with the food, and how hurt they were at a celebration where the young people didn't really want to have any salmon. They didn't like salmon. And the elders were just so destroyed. They couldn't understand thinking that way, but it's because they never grew up around the river with the salmon coming up and all the things that went with that. And I think these are the challenges that we have endured as a people, but these are also the challenges that we're continuing to do something about. Bringing back our salmon runs, opening up the salmon spawning areas, and even the insight of moving the salmon back above Grand Coulee Dam, which is not just for our region, but for all the people upstream, all the way into Canada. And with that, I want to thank you for a little bit of your time, and Limlim.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that historical background and for sharing your perspectives. I think you've set us up expertly to get a little bit deeper into the specific photograph. So now I'll invite Milo Carpenter to join us from the research lab at CSM. Welcome, Milo. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi. Thank you, Nicole, for the introduction. Before I get to the photograph identified as Nellie Freelander, I want to give a little bit of context into the Clyfford Still Museum's archival holdings and Clyfford Still's relationship to the Coville Confederated Tribes and Nez Pelem. The Clyfford Still Archives holds the largest collection of archival materials related to Clyfford Still, both as an artist and as a person. It includes correspondence with contemporary artists, museums, galleries, and friends, photographs, diary notes containing Still's opinions on art and the art scene, teaching materials, and more. However, it wasn't until 1945 when Clyfford Still moved to New York and established a studio when he realized that he should be preserving his communications, writings, and materials for a future archive. So our collection is rich of information from about 1944 to 1980 when Still passed away, but materials prior to 1944 are limited. And at this point, I'm going to turn over to the document camera. If this works, yes. What makes the Nez Perce material so paramount to our collection is that we have diary notes that Clifford Still kept, field notes from his visit to the reservation in 1936. You can see right here at the top, maybe. This is an example of those field notes. Thanks to the research of Patricia Failing from the University of Washington and a close colleague of the museum, we know that Clifford Still and Worth Griffin, often referred to as Griff, founded an artist colony in Nez Pelum in 1937, in which Still taught landscape painting to his students in 1937 and 1938. However, Still and Griff visited the reservation in 1936, and this is where Still made most of the photographs, drawings, paintings, and field notes at the reservation that we hold here in Denver. Through these field notes, we know that Clifford Still typically paid between $2.50 and $5 to persons on the reservation for sittings for his drawings, paintings, or photographs. Photographs were generally taken so he could finish a drawing or painting that could not be completed in a single sitting. He preferred to complete his artworks in sittings rather than from a photograph, of which many of my artist colleagues tell me that's consistent with their work, but there were times that only a photograph was the option. In Clifford Still's teaching notes, we can see that in the 1930s, Still did not necessarily view photography as an art form, but rather as a method of record keeping. In the early 1940s, when teaching in Richmond, Virginia, Still taught his students how to develop 35mm slides from the Kodachrome K828 film, which leads me to believe that he viewed photographs as an opportunity to make records of his artwork, but not necessarily as a method to create art. Interestingly enough, at Washington State University, in art classes, Still would take the time to study and teach about the eye and eyesight as a way to understand the way the human eye interprets color and contrast and framing and shade, but that never really translated into framing for photography. The photograph for this program was originally titled by the Clifford Still Archives as Portrait of a Woman in Traditional Native American Dress, and recently retitled also by the Clifford Still Archives as Portrait of a Woman Identified as Nellie Friedlander. It has some interesting history since coming into the archives, as both the date and the title of this photograph are currently in discussion. There has been some debate over the date of the photograph. When the photograph was first processed in the archives in October 2018, the date was identified as an inscription on the back of the print. The inscription lists 7.9-25, and that was originally assumed to be the date in which the photograph was taken, July 9th, 1925. It arrived as part of a group of photographs labeled by Patricia Still as Killam, Alberta, of which many of the shots are of the Alberta landscape from the mid to late 1920s. Due to scholarly review, the Clifford Still Archives no longer believes that that is the accurate date for the photograph. And we are unsure of what the inscription refers to, though hypotheses related to the inscription include a possible cataloging number that Patricia Still started using for photographs. The photograph was attributed to Clifford Still, and we know that Still did not visit the reservation until 1936, so he could not have taken the photograph in 1925. As you can see, the photograph is consistent with a photograph of the Grand Coulee Dam construction taken by Clifford Still in 1936. Additionally, the field notes from Clifford Still established that Nellie Friedlander sat with Still for a painting and sketches on June 19th and 20th in 1936. In these sittings, Clifford Still likely took a photograph of Nellie so he could complete his work, and the Clifford Still Archives believes that this photograph taken during the sitting would have been this photograph. Furthermore, As recently as earlier today, it was brought to the attention of the Clifford Still archives by members of the Friedlander family that the woman in the photograph may not be Nellie Friedlander, but her mother-in-law, Elizabeth Friedlander. Our current identification of the portrait is due to a comparison with a drawing by Clifford Still known as PD 87, in which he wrote Nellie Friedlander, 6/17/36, Nespelem, Washington. And I'm going to show that drawing now. In this drawing, we can see some consistencies with the photograph, including the earrings, feather, headpiece, and neckline of the dress. It is the current opinion of the archives that the person in this drawing is the same person in the photograph, though additional research by the archives will be done to confirm their identity. As we do not have many additional materials from the 1930s, we do not know for sure what camera or film Still may have used at the Nespelem Reservation. However, in our collection, we do have 3 additional negative portraits he took of 2 other members of the tribe. Cleveland, Kamiaken, and Mary Auhai. The latter was identified in the field notes as the oldest living member of the reservation. These negatives, assuming that they are originals, appear to be Kodachrome 616 film, which is a film created in 1932 for Kodak box cameras. And those negative prints would print at 2.5 by 4.5 inches, which is approximately consistent with these negatives, though they are actually slightly larger at 4.75 inches. In addition to these photographs, the Clifford Still Museums holds drawings and paintings of members of the Nespelem Reservation, including additional images of Cleveland, Komiaken, Mary Auhai, and Mrs. Friedlander. I'm going to pass it back to Michael to discuss some of the important details about the Friedlander family and this image.
Thank you, Milo. One of the things that I wanted to also thank you about, you gave a good, you tried really hard, and it's Kamiaken, but I knew you're probably going to have a challenge with that. As we finish,
my apologies.
That's okay. The painting that I'm sitting by here in the museum at Pullman, at the Art Museum, is a painting that's on display right now, and was painted by Worth Griffin, also in 1936. And this is a painting, his description of Elizabeth Friedlander. And this is kind of the description that he had. It said, a Moses Indian whose maiden name was Standing Cloud, was the daughter of Chief Standing Cloud. So with that, that was the description. And like a lot of these descriptions, there wasn't maybe a significant much more information about who the people were, who their families were, or that. But they primarily were able to get the names, and they would write these descriptions on the back of the paintings. And this is the information that we have. What I can add to the painting, and forgive me, I'll read it to you directly. Elizabeth Friedlander, 1855 to 1940, was a Wenatchee Eniat Indian who married the brother of Chief Moses, the Moses Columbia chief whose people were relocated to the Colville Indian Reservation in the late 1870s. She was baptized as Elizabeth by the Italian Jesuit priest, Father Urban Grassi. Elizabeth's first husband passed away, and she remarried a Jewish German pioneer in 1890. According to tribal elder Friedlander Jr., Nellie, 1883-1958, who was a Yakima Moses Columbia, married Elizabeth's first son, Louis Friedlander. Nellie's daughter was Lucy Friedlander Covington, Tribal Business Council, 1954 to 1978. She was a lifelong advocate for tribal sovereignty and instrumental in the tribe's rejection of the federal policy of termination on the Colville Indian Reservation in the late 1950s and 60s. The strength of these women reflect the continued importance of the matriarchal identity in tribal culture and political affairs throughout the Colville Confederated Tribes. And with that, that's what I'd like to add, and maybe open it up for any questions.
Thank you, Michael.
Mm-hmm.
So we do have a question from Jeanne. She wonders, do you think the Nespelem Art Colony could be established today? And if so, under what conditions would be set by the tribe?
Well, I think the latter point is absolutely the most important point. I think it absolutely could, but including the tribe and having them being a partner from the very beginning of what they feel that they would feel they would want and what would be appropriate. And in consultation with the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, I think that would be the starting point.
Thanks for that, Michael. Mila, we have a couple questions of folks interested really about the scope of the archival collections related to Still's time in Nespelem. Could you give us a sense of just the amount of materials that we have in the Clifford Still archives?
So the field notes is, I believe, 8 pages, maybe 7 pages long. So it's not a ton of material. As for photographs, we have the print of Mrs. Friedlander, and then we also have the other 3 negatives that I mentioned. There are also a handful of slides, as I mentioned, that Still would create them for all of his artworks. So there is a fairly sizable collection. I don't know an exact number off the top of my head. I apologize. But it's a relatively small amount of material, but related to the amount of material we have from his time prior to moving to New York, it's one of the more substantial pieces because he kept a diary of every day of the week that he was there.
That's great. And we have another question from Manon, who wants to know, do we have a sense of how the members of the Colville Reservation feel about this material and these portraits today? What kind of community consultation exists, if any at all?
Well, I think this is one of those opportunities to initiate that. I really feel that the opportunity is before us so many, I think, of the tribal members were just absolutely not aware that these even existed. And I think we have to be honest about that, that once the Clifford Still Museum was opened and the processing of his vast collection started to happen, that's when these materials came to light. They were not really publicly available. And so for tribal members, like many others, this is the first time they've ever had the chance to actually see or become aware of what's in this collection. I was talking to Frank Friedlander about the image, and he was telling me how important it was to have this image available, any images like these available, because at that time, tribal members did not have cameras. They were not taking pictures themselves. It wasn't even realistic that they could afford or do that. So to have access to an image like the one that the Clifford Still has of the woman that we've been talking about, it was so important for him, he said, because for the first time he could look in the eyes of the image and remember and think about all the stories of these elders that he was told about and how important they were. And it brought these feelings back to him. And I think this is the opportunity that we could have with the tribe, with many others. And it's a wonderful opportunity for the Clifford Still Museum. And I think it's something that they would surely want to pursue.
And I just concur with everything Michael just said.
That's great. I think this next question is maybe a little bit of for both of you as well. This is from Mary, and she asks, do we know how Clifford Still was received by Nez-Perce on the reservation?
I mean, that's a very good question. The field notes don't really approach that on my end. There's a lot on his reaction to the people of the tribe, but not so much of how he was perceived. I'd be interested if Michael has anything on that.
Well, I don't know that I would say something specifically for Clifford Still, not knowing that, but I will tell you that to think that at that time, we're talking about a reservation that was prior to this, absolutely removed primarily from everyone else. Unless you were actually living in that region and you had reasons to be in Nez-Perce, people were not going to Nez-Perce until just around that time, where people, with the building of Grand Coulee Dam, were people starting to travel to kind of see what was going on at Nez-Perce. It surely was not a place that people were going to go just venture to go see. And what I mean with that is there was still a real separation between the indigenous people, the tribal people, and non-tribal people. And so that creates a bit of a challenge. And I can only imagine that sensibility, that kind of feeling was existing even at that time. So for any non-native that people didn't know to come in, it took a while. They wanted to know who the people were, what was going on. And that, I'm sure, was the atmosphere that Clifford Still was navigating at that time.
Thanks, and hopefully we have time for one or maybe two more questions. We have interest from a participant about sort of the process behind the scenes. He's curious what evidence would be sufficient to conclude that Elizabeth was the subject of Still's photograph and drawing. What does it take to change the name or the date of an archival object? That might be a big question, Milo, but I had a feeling there would be some interest in this question tonight.
That's a very good question, and it would have been nice if we could have had a little bit more time to delve into the research of this with the information that came out today to the museum. It's going to be a matter of one, probably talking with the family and seeing what they maybe have in relation with it. As I say, we named the photo based on the title that Clifford gave to his drawing. And so we'd be curious in speaking with the family to see what they think about the comparison between the two at some point. In order to get something beyond the shadow of a doubt is pretty tough. And so it's at the point when it's like, if we can see a few other places in which it's identified as Elizabeth, and we can see a comparison and an explanation on the two together, that would be really helpful. And that would be what it would take in order to do so. But it may be one of those things that we never have a definitive answer from an archival perspective, and it may become one of those things that in the title we need to recognize that it could be more than one individual.
That's great, thanks, Milo. And just one last question for Michael from Joe Chen. He wants to know, do we know any Colville artists who studied with Still or Griffin?
As in Colville tribal artists?
That's my understanding of the question, yeah.
No, I don't think there's any knowledge of that. I always wanted to believe my mother would go to Nespelem when she was a young girl at that time with her grandfather. And she would travel periodically to the Indian Agency. And I always wanted to believe that she was there and got to see what they were doing that summer and other summers, and that inspired her because she later on herself became a painter, and she went to an Indian college and at Haskell in Lawrence, Kansas, and painted. And who knows? But there's a lot of Native American artists on the Colville Indian Reservation to this day, and who knows where some of these inspirations came from, but it's something that they're very proud of and that we're very proud of for our artistic people. And maybe there was some indirect interaction. I hope there was.
That's great. Well, I think that's all we have time for tonight. We do have a couple unanswered questions. So maybe we will try to address those in another way at another time, but clearly a really fascinating topic and an ever-evolving story, which is just really exciting to hear just a little bit about tonight from the two of you. So thank you so much for your presentations and your time. So it's really incredibly fascinating. Thanks also to all the staff behind the scenes helping make this happen, and to all of you for participating in this program tonight.